When scientists first began to unlock the Viking genome, what they discovered sent shockwaves through the very foundation of history, a discovery so startling that it tore apart centuries of myth, legend, and the romanticized image of tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed raiders thundering across Europe in dragon-headed ships. For generations, the Viking had been painted as a singular type: towering, muscular men with pale skin and golden hair, fierce warriors who embodied the cold and unyielding spirit of the North. Yet as archaeologists unearthed thousands of Viking skeletons from burial sites across Scandinavia, Greenland, Iceland, Russia, England, and even as far as the Mediterranean, they began to realize that the story written in bones and teeth was not the story carved into legend. The DNA of these warriors whispered secrets long buried, secrets so profound they threatened to erase the very face of the Viking as the world had come to know it. What the sequencing revealed was not a uniform people but a patchwork, a collision of identities and ancestries so diverse it seemed almost impossible that such individuals could have been grouped under one name. Among the skeletal remains of supposed Scandinavian kings were markers not of Nordic origin, but of Celtic and even Southern European ancestry. In mass graves at battle sites, warriors bore genes from the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and even Central Asia. Some remains of Viking settlers in Greenland shockingly carried traces of Native American lineage, suggesting contact and intermingling across oceans centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. Each new discovery deepened the mystery. Were the Vikings truly one people, or were they something else entirely? A brotherhood, a network, an identity forged in fire and storm that stretched far beyond the cold fjords of Norway and Denmark. The more scientists compared ancient DNA samples, the stranger the picture became. Blonde hair, the so-called trademark of the Norsemen, was not as common as legend suggested. In fact, dark-haired, olive-skinned individuals appeared again and again in Viking graves, their genetic markers pointing toward southern Europe, Asia Minor, and even the Middle East. The blood of warriors buried with swords and shields matched more closely to Slavic lands than to Norway, raising questions that scholars had long avoided. Were the Vikings not a distinct race at all, but a cultural movement, a way of life that welcomed outsiders who could fight, raid, and sail the seas? This revelation shook the foundations of history, for if the Vikings were not who we thought they were, then perhaps none of history's great peoples were what we imagined. Perhaps the very idea of pure bloodlines, of singular national identities, was a myth we told ourselves to make the past cleaner, simpler, more heroic than it ever truly was. And yet, for every revelation, the questions multiplied. In Sweden, a burial long assumed to be that of a powerful Viking warrior turned out to contain the remains of a woman, her DNA confirming her sex, her grave goods revealing her status, and her sword proving that she was no mere passenger in the Viking story, but a commander, a leader, perhaps a warrior queen whose existence had been erased by centuries of masculine storytelling. In England, Viking graves contained not only the bones of Scandinavian raiders, but the mingled remains of locals who had joined them, fighting and dying side by side, their DNA a testament to the blurring of enemy and ally, conqueror and conquered. And then came the most chilling discovery of all. In the far reaches of Russia, in Viking trade outposts stretching toward the Silk Road, geneticists found markers of Central Asian ancestry, suggesting that the Viking world was not isolated to the North Atlantic but stretched deep into the heart of Eurasia, touching cultures that had never before been linked to the Norse. Slowly, the Viking myth unraveled, and in its place rose a stranger, darker, and more human story. The Vikings were not simply Scandinavians, they were a storm of peoples, a moving tide of traders, raiders, explorers, and wanderers who pulled in blood from every coast they touched. Their power lay not in isolation but in absorption, in the ability to take in outsiders and make them Viking, to forge a new identity that transcended race, tribe, and birthplace. And with every bone examined, every tooth drilled for DNA, the truth grew louder: the Viking was not a man of the North. The Viking was an idea, a dangerous, powerful idea that anyone could become, if they were willing to set sail into the unknown. But this truth was unsettling, even terrifying, because it meant that history itself was not what we thought. It meant that the images carved into textbooks and museums were lies, comfortable illusions we told ourselves to hide the messy, chaotic, and interconnected nature of the past. And as the scientists presented their findings, the world was forced to confront an uncomfortable question: if the Vikings were not who we thought they were, then who are we? For the DNA evidence did not simply rewrite the story of the past, It reached out into the present, into the very blood of millions alive today, whispering that Viking ancestry is not a relic, not a distant memory, but a living force running through the veins of countless men and women across the world, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be understood. And so, the first chapter of this revelation ends not with certainty, but with unease, for in discovering who the Vikings truly were, we may have begun to uncover who we truly are, and that truth may be stranger, darker, and more extraordinary than we can yet imagine. The real storm broke when a grave in Birka, Sweden, one of the most famous Viking burial sites, shattered everything historians thought they knew about gender, power, and warfare in the Viking Age, for in that grave lay the fully equipped remains of a warrior long assumed to be a man. A battle axe, a sword, a bow, a gaming board that symbolized command, and 2 horses, everything that screamed the burial of a general, a warlord, a Viking hero. For over a century, scholars confidently told the story of him, until DNA testing whispered the unthinkable truth: the skeleton was female. A Viking woman, buried as a warrior, recognized as a leader, her bones carrying the same markers of strain and battle readiness as her male counterparts. The revelation spread like wildfire across the academic world and beyond, igniting debates that threatened to consume centuries of carefully crafted Viking narratives. Was she an anomaly, a rare exception in a man's world? Or was she proof that Viking society was far more complex, far more egalitarian, than the sagas and chroniclers ever admitted? Her face, reconstructed through DNA and bone scans, revealed a woman in her 30s, strong, sharp-featured, her ancestry a blend of Scandinavian and Baltic genes, and she became the emblem of a history that had been erased, the face of a truth buried not by time but by prejudice. And this was only the beginning, for grave after grave revealed secrets that mocked the clean lines of history. In Denmark, remains thought to be Viking settlers carried Celtic ancestry, their genes pointing to Ireland and Scotland, proof that Viking raiders had not merely pillaged but intermarried, adopting the blood of their enemies into their own lines. In England, DNA revealed Viking burials containing locals who had chosen the Viking path, men who abandoned their homeland's identity to sail and raid under the raven banners of the north. Even more shocking were the genetic fingerprints of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern ancestry among Viking dead, markers that told of journeys far beyond the icy north, of trade routes that carried them into the Byzantine Empire, to the sands of the Levant, and perhaps even farther. One grave in southern Norway contained a man with DNA linked to Persian ancestry, his burial goods including a blade forged in steel that could only have come from the east, suggesting that the Viking world was not just northern Europe but a global crossroads, a network stretching from Greenland to Baghdad. And as researchers compared DNA from across these sites, a chilling realization emerged: there was no typical Viking. Some had blonde hair, yes, but others carried the genes for black or brown hair, even red, with eye colors ranging from deep brown to startling green. Their skin tones varied, some pale as the northern sun, others darker, carrying genes from southern lands, and yet all of them, when buried, were buried with the trappings of Viking identity. It became clear that Vikinghood was not something you were born into but something you could become, a status earned through loyalty, violence, and adventure. This revelation unsettled more than academics, it threatened national identities. For modern Scandinavians who proudly traced their ancestry to pure Viking blood suddenly found that their forebears were not so different from the rest of Europe, that the Viking Age was not an isolated Scandinavian story but a messy, multicultural saga of mingling, migration, and shared blood. Governments resisted, textbooks lagged, but the DNA told a truth too loud to ignore, and with each sequencing, the myth of the Viking grew stranger. The idea of Vikings as homogeneous conquerors faded, replaced by something darker, a recognition that they had been global before the word existed, that their reach stretched not only across oceans but across bloodlines, pulling in every people they encountered. Yet in the shadows of this discovery lurked something even more haunting, for DNA tests on Viking remains in Greenland showed traces of Native American ancestry, suggesting contact across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. Had Viking explorers truly reached the Americas and not only landed but mingled, creating children whose bloodlines carried back to the icy north? If so, then history was far more entangled than we could bear to imagine. Some scholars whispered that this evidence was only the tip of the iceberg, that deeper, more ancient links remained buried, that the Vikings may have been conduits of an older, global network of exchange and identity long erased by war and time. And with each new study, each fragment of bone, the story of the Vikings grew more mysterious. They were no longer the blonde giants of sagas, but shapeshifters of history, their true faces hidden behind centuries of myth, their real identities scattered across the world like shards of a shattered mirror. But the greatest terror of all was the realization that perhaps we will never truly know what a Viking looked like, because the Viking was not one thing but many, not one people but a storm of peoples, bound together by violence, trade, and the insatiable hunger to explore. The DNA whispered of a brotherhood without borders, a people who could not be defined by race or nation, but only by the fire in their blood and the sea beneath their ships, and that truth, for many, was too much to bear. The deeper scientists dug into the Viking genome, the stranger and more unsettling the story became, because the DNA did not merely rewrite history, it whispered of mysteries that stretched beyond history itself. In Iceland, one of the most isolated Viking outposts, samples from ancient burials revealed genetic traces that could not be explained by any known migration routes of the time. Markers suggesting contacts with peoples of Asia long before official records showed such encounters, as if the Vikings had sailed not only west into the Atlantic but east, deep into unknown rivers and steppes, absorbing bloodlines from the furthest corners of the Old World. And in one grave, found beneath a windswept cliff in Greenland, the remains of a woman carried Native American ancestry, a clear sign that transatlantic contact had not only occurred but left descendants, raising chilling questions about just how much of the New World was known to these northern seafarers. The sagas hinted at Vinland, but DNA proved the sagas had been holding back a deeper truth. The Vikings had crossed oceans and mingled with distant peoples, and their story was far more global than anyone dared admit. Yet the revelations did not stop at ancestry. As scientists reconstructed faces from DNA, the illusion of the classic Viking dissolved into something startling. They did not all look alike. Some had angular, Mediterranean features, others softer Baltic traits, some with pale blue eyes and blonde hair, others with dark eyes and olive-toned skin, and still others carried the coppery tones of distant ancestry far outside Europe. The Viking face was not one face but a kaleidoscope of humanity, united not by blood but by culture and conquest. And that realization struck like thunder, because it meant that Viking was not a race, not even a people, but an idea, one that transcended borders, one that could swallow whole anyone daring enough to join their world. But the most haunting discoveries were the ones scientists could not easily publish, for some of the Viking burials carried DNA anomalies, genetic markers that did not fit cleanly into the known map of human ancestry. They looked ancient, older than they should have been, as if the Vikings had tapped into bloodlines lost to time, or carried remnants of tribes that official history had erased. Were these echoes of Neolithic migrations, or something else, something deeper, like traces of civilizations older than the Viking Age, preserved through intermarriage, whispers of lost cultures buried in the north? Legends spoke of giants and gods who mingled with mortals, and now the bones seemed to hint at truths stranger than myth. Archaeologists tried to stay silent, but whispers spread of Viking remains with unusual heights, strange skull shapes, or unexplained genetic outliers that suggested a mingling with peoples unknown. Some researchers dared to ask if perhaps the sagas of Aesir gods walking among men were distorted memories of encounters with a people so advanced, so different, that they seemed divine. Others whispered of Atlantis, of Hyperborea, of forgotten civilizations whose blood still ran in Viking veins. And as these revelations built, so too did the unease, for modern descendants who traced their DNA back to Viking roots discovered the truth was not always welcome. Some families proudly expecting Scandinavian purity instead found lineages stretching to Slavs, Celts, Inuit, Persians, even ancient tribes from the Middle East, and with that came the collapse of long-cherished myths of blood. The Viking story was not about purity but about chaos, a living storm of interwoven identities. Yet, strangely, that made them stronger, for it was precisely this mixing, this adaptability, that had allowed them to thrive, to conquer, to survive. Still, as geneticists released their findings, something darker unfolded. Online, extremist groups who had clung to the myth of the pure Viking raged, denouncing the science, calling it lies, while others tried to twist the findings into new dangerous myths. The DNA had set fire to more than academia. It had torn open wounds of identity and belonging that still bled today. But buried beneath this chaos lay an even greater revelation, one that could shake not only history but the story of humanity itself. For in sequencing ancient Viking remains, Scientists found mutations, adaptations to cold, to sea life, to high-fat diets, that were not only advanced but eerily specific, as if the Viking genome itself had been sculpted by centuries of survival on the edge of the world. Some of these genetic traits remain in modern Scandinavians: resilience to cold, unusual endurance, even mental adaptability, and the question arose: did the Vikings become who they were because of where they lived, or because their ancestors had already been something more? The sagas spoke of Odin gifting wisdom, of gods shaping destinies, and now science hinted that perhaps there had been intervention, whether by nature, evolution, or something far stranger. The final blow came when researchers compared Viking DNA to global databases, and a pattern emerged. Clusters of genetic markers found in Vikings also appeared in populations thousands of miles away, in places with no recorded Viking presence, as if echoes of their blood had traveled across the earth long before recorded voyages. Could it be that the Viking story was not just about ships and raids, but about something older, deeper, a hidden chapter of human migration lost to time, a network of forgotten exchanges stretching back into the mists of prehistory? If true, then the Vikings were not merely raiders of the past but the inheritors of something ancient, something that still sleeps within human blood. And as the data spread, the world was left staring into a mirror darker than any saga, realizing that the question was never, what did Vikings look like? But rather, what do their faces tell us about ourselves? For the DNA had stripped away the myths and revealed something raw, something terrifying: that humanity's story is not pure, not simple, not separate, but a storm of mingling, conquest, survival, and reinvention. And in that storm, the Vikings were both destroyers and creators, not gods, not demons, but a reflection of the truth that history has always tried to hide: that we are all the children of forgotten minglings, that our faces are maps of journeys long erased, and that the real terror is not in what the Vikings looked like, but in the fact that they looked like all of us, because in some way, their blood is still here, flowing in veins that stretch from the fjords to every corner of the earth, whispering that the story is not finished, and the past is not as far away as we think.